honorable colleagues, fellow presidents, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We know that many countries and regions have a very complicated system of interfaces between the knowledge which is accumulated in experts and scientists, and between those who have the mandate for making decisions for the better future, but who have already left this audience today. Basically, there are two major interfaces that link policy making and community of experts. Firstly, basically all developed countries and also many developing countries have a quite robust system for shaping and implementing what we call policy for science. This means financing and steering research and development to some extent, and sometimes also innovation in the country. And this includes also systematically framing which problems are necessary to solve for the country and how the efforts are financed. But there must be another side of the coin. There should be a complementary link that frames how knowledge which is produced in scientific community is used, making our life better. The necessity of the first link is obvious for administration. This is the life of administration. But why the second link, feedback from science to policy, is really important? It was formulated perhaps first already by Henry Thomas Buckle, who is the father of contemporary history science. And he formulated that around 150 years ago. And he wrote that in the past, seen from his time, the richest were countries with the most rich nature. But already in his time, 150 years ago, the richest were the countries with the most expeditious people, the smartest people. There is only one small change since that time. Today, the wealthiest are those countries who have the most massive and productive scientific community. And this is not only a bare observation, but it needs some action to make use of the knowledge of smart people for society. And this use has actually become standard in economic decisions, as we have also heard today, but it has much more potential. How large the potential is giving a partial answer, a study made in Estonia about 5 years ago. So the estimates show that under some conditions, the rate of increase in GDP in Estonia could be easily doubled if the already existing knowledge in scientific community would be properly used for the benefit of society. Now the point is, what does it mean, properly? And I'm coming back to that several times today. So the largest gap, which was mentioned in this report, and which is actually today worldwide known, the largest gap in this context is that the best scientific knowledge is infrequently, or in some countries almost never, used as component of political decision making. Even though there are several signs today that in particular the ability to extract the very best advice for political decisions from the knowledge pool which is accumulated in scientific landscape, this is gradually becoming one of the main pillars of the competitiveness of countries, regions, and even continents. So put it in other words, proper science advice for policy is, literally saying, a gateway to a future that is worth of living. The problem, to start with, is that this kind of knowledge, scientific knowledge, is never spread homogeneously, and neither is it available equally in all countries and regions, especially in small countries like the Baltic countries. And on top of that, external conditions, for example, driven by pandemic, mentioned several times today, they change so rapidly that even a little bit older knowledge could already be obsolete in changing conditions. So this situation, it's not hopeless. In contrary, it contains a lot of hope. This situation basically calls for an appropriate and smart organization of this link from the existing pool of knowledge to both strategic and everyday decision-making, and not only for economical benefit, but also, as said already, a component of political decision-making. I must say that not many countries or regions or fields currently have the privilege of already having such a properly functioning channel. The situation is that in many occasions this kind of channel is mixed with other functions or links, and then it is usually not as effective as it could be. What often happens, and what happens very regularly in our Baltic countries, it's a mix of science for policy, together with lobby for science, and also science funding decisions, or even with its basic counterpart, policy for science. So generally, even in many of most developed European countries, the science for policy channel is considerably less developed compared to policy for science. And I would even say it's basically underdeveloped. It's mostly not institutionalized, except for Anglo-Saxon countries, and it has mainly distributed nature. A kind of system for the use of scientific knowledge for policy making has been created at the European Commission level only 1 decade ago, just 10 years ago, which is absolutely tiny time period in geological sense. But it's also clear that it's not enough to have it only on European Commission level. To my understanding, this understanding of many today, it's equally important to have a kind of properly functioning, I would say even ecosystem of science advice also on the country and region level. And it's also important to ensure that such systems, which are of course different in different countries, they should somehow function in a harmonized manner. And to paraphrase the one of the past presidents of America, only then we can make Europe great again. One institution which I represent is the European Science Advisors Forum. This is an entity which is a small piece in this kind of ecosystem of science advice, which is working towards evidence-based policy making. And for Academy of Sciences, it's really important that we detach ourselves from the old-fashioned eminence-based advice and switch to evidence-based advice. A small change, remember, a small step for me, but great step for mankind. And we work all the time having in mind that scientific expertise and evidence not only should, but they must play a significant role in preparing policy decisions at all levels. Just a few words about this forum. It's relevant to Latvia. Membership in this forum is based on country representation, 1 person per country. Members have been invited by the European Commission. They have to be in the formal and active position to provide scientific advice, which is, must be on the highest quality and based on publicly available research. I'm happy to say that Latvia has just a few weeks ago nominated Dr. Mikelis Grīviņš, chairperson of the Board of Association of Latvian Young Scientists, as representative of Latvia in this forum, where now 29 European countries are represented. So welcome, Latvia is part of this organization. So okay, the goal of this organization in nice words which have been produced today, I think 5 times. It's to facilitate sharing and exchange of information, expertise, practices and results. You know those words, you can repeat them yourself. But you all know that such an exchange, it doesn't come natural. It needs a lot of efforts. And this leads me to one of the important points of scientific advice for policy, namely the ways of formulations and formats of messages and channels for communication of the condensed information from academics to policy-making level. They are greatly different in different countries. They are even very much different in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And this is absolutely natural because of difference in how different countries have built the governance system in their countries. So a cornerstone of giving science advice on country and regional level is understanding that the variety of structures and institutions for such advice across different national governments is of great value in itself. We know that many fields of this activity are today functioning on a landscape of strictly limited resources, which also have been mentioned today a few times. And in such situation, the consequences of careless actions could do irreversible damage. And it is, of course, really crucially important to address such fields with great care and think at least a dozen times before making any strong move. Which means, another important point, a really substantiated action, therefore requires not only critics of your own government, but also consolidation of the relevant knowledge from a larger region and also in many occasions consensus with neighbors. And we know that there is no solution for science advice that would fit to all cases. An important lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic is that it has shown how important are 2 things, flexibility and trust in the advice system, if you really want to be heard. And in this sense, of course, it's important to learn from each other about successful cases, but everybody's doing that. Which is much more important is to gather together and discuss the reasons for failures, which are normally not published or advertised, but they aren't really. In spite of great differences in organization of science advice, there are several ground principles which are the same everywhere, and they are meant to ensure quality and trustiness. You can count different number of principles. I don't like the magical number 7. I like more number 8. There are 8 principles. 3 of them are sort of basic pillars: independence of advice, transparency of advice, and responsibility. So you really know what you're doing. The 5 others are slightly simpler but more complicated to interpret. They are accountability, diversity, which means that including not only exact sciences, life science, but also social science and humanities. Then timeliness, if you are late, it's gone. Rigor, you have to really prove that what you are saying is coming from first principles. And last, but I think most important, it's called demarcation, which means shaping policy, but not taking decisions. And this principle is one of the things which is most frequently completely ignored. In a way, it says how science advice should be based. So, analysis, rather than a strict advice to follow at all costs some solution, what you like. It's also a kind of warning. If you advise, stay as detached from the policy-making decisions as possible. This is the only way to retain independence. Provide the analysis, but try not to favor any particular option. clarify what options need to be analyzed, base advice on published peer-reviewed science where possible. This is just for quality and consistency. And if I now think about the last presentation of the before lunch, then it violated all those principles. It showed clearly why Latvia is lagging behind in an economical sense. Lack of discipline, inability to force discipline when necessary. They are features which are carefully monitored by the government, and if it's complemented with bad science, then it's a guarantee that the government will never listen. You may ask that if I think that science-based advice is in high demand, then why it's not always followed? And we hear quite frequently that government is saying there are other arguments. The important point is that science advice as such, and the advice which is provided is just one, even though important component of decision-making. But it's important to distinguish, repeating myself, the demarcation line, the red line, distinguishing the mandate of providing advice, which is in hands of experts and academics, from the mandate of political decision-making, which is in the hands of elected policymakers, not in our hands. There is now some experience with science advice from the European Commission level, and the message from the group of chief science advisors, there are 7 to the European Commission, is very simple. To be trusted, the advice must have 3 components. It should be made public, it should be based on the best knowledge, and then it should come from a body with a clear mandate. It's easier to say than to follow these principles. But again, reverting to some things which have been discussed today, the problem is actually even wider. It is somehow connected to even such things like the voices of anti-mask motions and anti-vaccination. So Janis Malaks mentioned those things as well. But I would like to stress, even though I'm using now 1 more minute than necessary, it is well known from a massive number of social science research that rejection of official information is almost always related to a lack in trust in public institutions. It's not a problem in itself, it's a reflection. Fighting with anti-vaccination as such is never successful. What we can do and we must do is to increase the trust into public administration. And we know that science and scientists are usually the most trusted parts of society. A simple way to increase trust into public institutions is to listen for them what science says. So, looking actually very positively and optimistically into the future, it seems that these countries who are, I would say, brave enough to incorporate systematically science advice as part of political decisions at all levels will most likely enjoy massive improvement of their competitiveness in foreseeable future. Thank you very much.